Welcome to One Last Take, a podcast about seeing film from every angle. I'm Wes Skinner, and today's episode is the first in a series called Double Feature, where I pair two films I think are in conversation with each other based on a shared theme. Today's theme is doomed romance. Hope you enjoy. So I'm continuing a trend from last time of talking about the kind of cinematic romance I know best, the bittersweet kind. Though in today's case, I guess we're going a little further into bitter territory, with our first double feature episode focusing on doomed romance. When you hear that, you might be thinking I'm going the Romeo and Juliet angle, something where some sweet, well-meaning people fall in love and life tragically has other plans. But instead, we're talking about the types of romance that are doomed from the start, between pairs of people that are drawn to each other in some ways, but are horrible for each other in others. Now, I could have gone multiple directions with this. The 90s, for example, are chock full of erotic thrillers that start with sexual tension and end in violence. The last couple decades, especially in the indie scene, have featured plenty of toxic relationships like the uncomfortably raw Blue Valentine, or on the more psychological side of things, Paul Thomas Anderson's Phantom Thread. But when selecting pairings for double features, there are many other factors to consider, including runtime, momentum, and pacing. If one of these is slightly off, it can feel less like an intentional double feature and more like just watching two movies back to back. For example, maybe two films pair together in tone like Peanut Butter and Jelly, but if they're each 2+ hours long, it might feel a little long-winded. You want films that check some similar boxes, but you also don't want two movies back to back that feel repetitive. And of course, there's the most important decision of all, which film to watch first and which to watch second. So while digging through my possible options, I knew I wanted some sort of genre romance hybrid for each pick. And my choice for the first film became clear almost immediately. Nicholas Ray's In a Lonely Place. It's got a pretty great track record with avid film fans while being just off the beaten path enough that a lot of newer cinephiles have yet to see it. It's also a refreshingly subversive detour for people who might think they know where the plot's going, and there's plenty of thematic meat on the bones to discuss. Film number 2, however, was going to be a little trickier. While it's brisk, In a Lonely Place isn't exactly an upbeat film, but making a complete turn into, say, something comedic or action-packed might feel a little out of place here. So I started to consider other romance noir hybrids until I came across a contemporary favorite of mine, Park Chan Wook's Decision to Leave. Given Park snuck into the conversation recently with no other choice, I thought it would be perfect to honor a film that I, along with the film world as a whole, didn't appreciate it as much as it deserved when it first released in 2022. It's a much longer, more intense journey, but it's even more propulsive and complex, making In a Lonely Place a nice thought-provoking appetizer before the main course. One film provides a template for the noir genre while subverting it drastically for the time, while the other serves as a complete reimagining of those tropes, now with a little more resonance and context. Before I get into each of these films in detail and compare them, I want to note that I will be getting into spoilers for both. This is, after all, an in-depth analysis of what makes them so interesting, not only to watch individually, but back to back as well. So if you'd prefer, maybe go watch the movies first before listening any further. But also, if you don't mind spoilers and would love to have these ideas and themes fresh in your head before going into it, then that works too. Without further ado, let's get started with In a Lonely Place, which, as I said, was directed by Nicholas Ray and stars Humphrey Bogart, Gloria Graham, Frank Lovejoy, Carl Benton Reed, Art Smith, Jeff Donnell, and Martha Stewart. No, not that Martha Stewart. In 1950, 5 years before taking the world by storm with Rebel Without a Cause, iconoclastic director Nicholas Ray took film noir, the defining genre of the previous decade, and stamped one last signature on it before moving on to new horizons. In a Lonely Place starts the same way as any noir, with a murder. One night, down on his luck Hollywood screenwriter, the perfectly named Dixon Steele, is presented a book by his agent, who insists an adaptation of it will turn Steele's career around. He reluctantly takes the book home, along with excitable hat-check girl Mildred, who he asks to explain the book to him since she happens to be a huge fan. Eventually agreeing to disagree on the book's merits, the two part ways, with Steele handing Mildred some cab fare for the ride home. The next morning, Mildred is found dead, with Steele tagged as the prime suspect. Luckily for Steele, his brief encounter was witnessed by neighbor Laurel, who vouches for Steele while simultaneously admitting her attraction to him. The two soon fall in love, and Dixon finds himself inspired enough to begin writing again. It isn't long, however, before his true colors begin to show, and his fiery temper has everyone, including Laurel, second-guessing his innocence in Mildred's murder. In a Lonely Place wasn't immediately embraced by the majority of filmgoers, most of whom were expecting either a more straightforward romance or a more straightforward noir. Instead, what they got was a dissection of both genres, as well as a dissection of its lead Bogart's larger-than-life persona. At this point in Ray's career, his talent was widely acknowledged, but audiences had yet to acclimate themselves to his penchant for avoiding cliches and black-and-white morality. Ray's decision to use the murder, a traditional noir plot, as a backdrop for the real story, which is a psychological breakdown of Steele's self-loathing and rage, is nothing short of genius. The project was also a bold and self-aware choice on Bogart's part, given the many parallels between him and the character. Misogyny, toxic masculinity, and male entitlement had pretty much become the norm in the medium and, as we know, sadly wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Many noir films exposed the darker side of the cinematic tough guy persona, but very few would make it clear whether they were glorifying or challenging it. So it's sort of a shock that In a Lonely Place flat out dismantles it in such a direct way, and I don't know that it works as well without Bogart there to hold a mirror up to his own previous performances. In hindsight, there has always been a little of that grit and shadow underneath his cool, romantic exterior. Even his signature Rick in Casablanca is stubborn to a fault and selfish. I think part of why Bogart's career stands the test of time is that he wasn't afraid of flawed characters in an industry and era where image is everything. And given In a Lonely Place was produced by his own Santana Productions, he was likely very aware of the similarities audiences would observe between himself and Steele, who was essentially the brutally honest version of his usual archetype. Bogart's trademark charisma and reputation as the staple noir anti-hero are as present as always, but here they're weaponized to make the audience forget whose side we're on. Certain scenes in the first two-thirds of the film are completely recontextualized, whether you're imagining him as guilty or innocent from the central crime. But as the mystery slowly fades into the background, it becomes clear that the answers were never really the point. Gloria Graham's Laurel is another inspired invention, taking the outlines of the traditional femme fatale and creating a character who is more empathetic and vulnerable. When she's introduced, she's stoic and mysterious, with a nearly impenetrable poker face that hides both her intentions and feelings. We only really know she's attracted to Dixon and at least somewhat drawn to the sense of danger that follows him around. But even that could be a ruse for all we know. Another film might see her blackmailing Dixon or in cahoots with Mildred's real murderer, but the more we get to know Laurel, the more we realize that Mystique is only surface level. She simply desires a peaceful life with someone exciting. And when she's ready for Dixon to let down his walls as she has hers, she's only met with more darkness and anger under the surface. There's a scene where she shares her fears and suspicion of Dixon's guilt with a friend, and Graham provides an iconically chilling delivery of this one line. "I came here because I wanted to say these things and be laughed at, but you're not laughing." The film keeps Laurel and the audience guessing if Dixon has actually committed murder for most of the runtime, with their relationship wearing thin the more Dixon explodes into violent outbursts. There's a tense set piece that sees Dix visiting his friend in the police force, Nikolai, and his wife for dinner after his name is initially cleared from the case. The three sit down, and Steele, now creatively re-inspired, shares with them how he imagines Mildred's murder took place. He even asks them to reenact it as he narrates. He describes the man putting an arm around Mildred's neck and pulling tight. As Nikolai's arm tightens around his wife's neck, the light draws a streak across Dixon's face, cutting through the darkness as he grows a little too excited to be visualizing the carnage. And it would almost be fitting to see horns and fangs emerge as he continues. The scene abruptly concludes with Nikolai's wife gasping for air, and Nikolai releases his arm, not realizing how hard he was pulling. This is where the true message of the film slowly starts to emerge, that it ultimately might not matter if Dixon ever actually killed someone. Sure, we still want to know, but his streak of destruction rains chaos in ways big and small for everyone that passes through his orbit. Even when excitement rises around his new screenplay, he refuses to be satisfied, showing that even he isn't safe from his own resentment or disdain. His threatening and imposing nature forces Laurel to agree to marry him out of fear, afraid of what he might do if she says no. When Dixon finds out Laurel has an escape plan, however, he erupts into another fit of rage, this time resulting in him nearly strangling her to death. He stops himself just in time, and this is when the film delivers its final gut punch. The phone rings and it's the police. They've resolved that Mildred's killer was indeed not Dixon, but Mildred's boyfriend, and they apologize for insisting that he was the prime suspect. Bogart's sunken face communicates the bitter emptiness of this reveal. It's too late. He's compromised his soul, and he knows it. Laurel picks up the phone herself as Dixon is already headed for the door. The police share the news with Laurel, and she tearfully replies, "Yesterday this would have meant so much to us, but now it doesn't matter at all." She watches as Dixon leaves, reciting a line he brainstormed with her when they still had a chance. The ending is so brilliantly tragic and brutally honest because what would be a shocking twist in any other noir is merely a twisting of the knife into the heart of the central romance. Throughout the film, Dixon shows just enough humanity, just enough awareness that we're hoping, along with Laurel, that he changes his ways. It makes it believable that Laurel would stick around as long as she does, and when things finally reach the point of no return, it's clear both characters know it. The film suggests multiple times that Dixon is aware of his temper, and oftentimes in hindsight when he's gone too far. For instance, he apologizes at one point for scaring Nikolai and his wife at dinner. But there are some things you simply can't take back, and building all of the movie's tension around whether or not our lead is capable of reaching that point is just as bold and harrowing now as it was 75 years ago. It's also just refreshing knowing that even back then, some people might have agreed men need therapy. In all seriousness, I adore this movie, and I think it was just one of the best examples of an unlikable protagonist with a linear arc. What I mean is, there are hundreds of movies, maybe thousands, about a flawed lead character that starts off mean and gets meaner. It's oftentimes a tortured creative, or maybe an athlete, or a business tycoon who steps on everyone around them to achieve their goals. But because they haven't stopped to address whatever it is that rots inside them, these stories often end tragically. Hell, Scorsese has more or less built an entire career off of this trope, and it continues to flourish, even as recently as this year's Marty Supreme. But I think there's a strong argument to be made that it's never been quite done like it is in A Lonely Place, and probably never will be again. And I think that's because the movie is less interested in this journey back to Hollywood relevancy as it is in the unchecked part of his psyche that refuses to stop himself before he explodes. It's an intimate and uncomfortable look at the relationship between men and anger, and it never places the blame on some childhood trauma or chip on Dixon's shoulder. Regardless of the cause, this is a part of Dixon, and it's up to him to reckon with that. Not to speculate too much, but I can imagine working on this film forced Bogart to do just that. And that's why I think this is one of his most complex and emotionally raw performances ever put to screen. Now it's time to lighten the load just a little with our second film, which you could argue is maybe equally as bleak, but has a damn good time doing it. And that's acclaimed Korean director Park Chan Wook's Decision to Leave. As I said before, I wanted to pick something that shared thematic DNA with our first film, but felt like a completely different viewing experience. In a Lonely Place is subversive but straightforward. Decision to Leave, however, is labyrinthian and borderline hard to follow at times, but that's part of what makes the film so exciting. It's like a ride that forces you to grab tight to the rails, or else you'll fly right off. So despite this being the longer of the two films, this almost interactive nature of viewing makes it a great movie for keeping the momentum going on our double feature. The film stars Park Hae-il as insomniac detective Jang Hae-jun, who, while his wife spends most of the week out of town for work, becomes absorbed in his cases, spending most of his time staking out and observing suspects. The body of the inciting murder this time around is found at the bottom of a mountain, in what appears at first glance to be a rock climbing accident. That is, until the dead man's younger Chinese immigrant wife, Song Soo-rae, played by Tang Wei, arrives at the police station for questioning. Despite a language barrier, Hae-jun's partner is convinced that she's the prime suspect, while Hae-jun himself is immediately drawn to her mystique and charm. Over a series of interviews and stakeouts, infatuation turns into obsession. Though once Soo-rae's husband's death is declared a suicide, he slowly finds the feelings are mutual. Through a series of coincidences, however, Hae-jun begins to learn that Soo-rae might not be so innocent after all, and his preconceived ideals of right and wrong become tested. I'm only scratching the surface of the plot here, mostly due to the fact that the only real way to make total sense of it is by watching it all unfold on screen. Every scene is filled to the brim with information and subtext, with the editing luring the viewer further down the rabbit hole with unique scene transitions and an almost dreamlike rhythm. Each beat takes a moment to sink in, and at times you're left questioning if what you're seeing on screen perfectly lines up with the reality of what's actually happening. One moment, characters will be talking on the phone across town, only for the camera to pan and reveal one of them sitting across from the other, with voices still muffled as though they're coming from the tinny speaker of a flip phone. In other cases, I might find the disorienting effect this provides to be annoying or needlessly pretentious, but director Park is extremely deliberate in his use of all these techniques, and the necessary recalibration between scenes makes the viewing experience all the more engrossing as a result. There's an utter refusal here to handhold or spoon-feed any context or exposition. It's all on screen, but Park wants you to work for it. This kind of storytelling is somewhat inherent in Korean cinema, but it's also being utilized to put you in the headspace of our lead detective. The mystery to solve here is not merely identifying the killer. It's asking what these characters really want, and making the audience question if the feelings expressed between them are genuine, or merely a product of circumstance, as these are questions the characters are asking themselves. And because there is a murder at the center of it, the stakes feel much higher than just some run-of-the-mill story about an unhappily married schlub having an affair. The real arc here is Hae-jun's existential search for something real amid the surreal and often depressing life he's let himself sink into. And while we're unsure of Soo-rae's real intentions, there's a tangible pain there, and a sense that moving around and the potential murder are all desperate means for an escape. It's a universal feeling we can all relate to without knowing what she's escaping from. Tang Wei communicates this beautifully while still maintaining a veil of femme fatale mystique, keeping the performance emotional yet rooted in the genre sensibilities of the film's world. Meanwhile, Park Hae-il's performance has layers of its own, playing a character we should dislike on paper with an underlying sadness and doe-eyed longing. Hae-jun's having an emotional affair behind his wife's back, and it could be argued he's abusing his role in law enforcement to essentially stalk a suspect. The film doesn't ignore the negative impact these actions have on those around him, but his motivations are made clear and relatable despite being entirely selfish. When we first meet him, he's obsessed with his work, but it's never really portrayed as though he's passionate about it. It's clearly an outlet for his need for a sense of purpose. Shown in flashy style during a fight with a perp, he's good at what he does, but we get the feeling it's only because he feels he needs to be good at something. And when Soo-rae enters the picture, she takes precedent over the work immediately. There's even a pretty substantial subplot involving a crime conspiracy that eventually fades into the background to show Hae-jun's old life fading away upon Soo-rae's arrival. What develops between them becomes even more fascinating, as the foundation their relationship is built off of creates this interesting layer between them. There's even a point where Soo-rae says, "I want you to continue treating me like you're a detective and I'm a suspect," as though there's some invisible wall that she either wants there or she refuses to break down to make their relationship any more intimate than it is. And this is where we can tie things back to In a Lonely Place, where in both cases a person in the central romance is potentially a murderer, and its relevance becomes a question for the audience, and to a point a challenge for the characters. It brings up questions like, if someone is capable of something horrible, does it matter if they did it or not? Where exactly is the line between intention and action? And maybe most interestingly, can we still see someone in the same light after seeing a certain side of them? And if so, what does that say about us? Using these genre tropes as table setting for discussions about relationships, attraction, obsession, and individual discovery makes both of these films thought-provoking and standouts of their respective eras. And that's why I thought they'd make a nice pairing. And I hope it gives you something to think about when you either watch them together or just both separately at some point. So that's our double feature of doomed romance. I hope you enjoy these two films and that this episode gave you something to think about or discuss or maybe argue about with cinephile friends. If you do get around to watching these, please share your thoughts below. Next episode, we'll be circling back to the good, the bad, and the underrated for February, my wrap-up of the previous month of new releases. I've got a lot to discuss in that episode, so please be sure to check that one out. As always, you can find more of my film thoughts at one_last_take on Letterboxd. And stay tuned for plenty of great stuff coming up in the month of March. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.